DreAllDay.com.
Now tuned into the show where you learn the discipline to show up day after day to do the work, the confidence to put yourself out there boldly and authentically, and the mental toughness to continue showing up, doing the work, putting yourself out there, even when the success you've expected to achieve has yet to be achieved. And on top of all this, you get a huge dose of personal initiative. That is the go-getter energy that moves any one of us, including yourself, to go and make things happen instead of waiting for things to happen. And then we put all this together into a series of frameworks, approaches, insights, strategies, and techniques all underneath the umbrella of one unified philosophy that is called Work on Your Game. My name is Dre Baldwin, also known as Dre All Day, and welcome to the show. And today's topic is the case for homeschooling. Yes, I'm going to make a case. Yes, me, am going to make a case for homeschooling. Why should you homeschool? Why does it make sense to homeschool? What is the value of homeschooling? I'm going to make that case here today. Before we get started, actually, I'm going to make this case over the next 4 episodes. And before we get started on any of it, let me remind you of 2 things, actually 3 things. First of all, my text message number is down below in the description. Secondly, if you're not on my email list and getting my daily game emails every single day, go to workonmygame.com and make sure you're getting my emails for free. Third, workonyourgameuniversity.com. That's where you have me as your direct coach and where we get to work specifically on your specific situation for your personal and your professional life, starting with your mindset, then moving on to the strategy, systems, and accountabilities with my direct help during the entire process. That all happens at workonyourgameuniversity.com. This topic here today, the case for homeschooling. Now, I've touched on this a bit in the previous episode of this show. I told you in a couple of days ago I was talking about this, and today I'm going to go into more detail, and tomorrow and the day after that, and the day after that. I told you it's going to be a 4-part series. So in short, homeschooling, folks, those of you who don't know what it is the process of children being taught their schooling at home by parents, guardians, or private tutors, as opposed to going to a public or a private school, like a building where there's a bunch of other kids who get sent there and they're in a classroom with a bunch of other kids. Y'all know what school looks like. Homeschooling is doing the same thing, just doing it at home, or again with a private tutor, or maybe being taught by your parents, guardians, etc. And it could be with a group of other kids as well. Everything else that needs to be said about this is going to be said within the points of this series. So I'm going to lay out every single point. I'm going to lay out the arguments. I'm going to lay out the counter arguments. I'm going to tell you where I stand, why I stand there, and just overall why I've come to this perspective on the subject. I told you back in episode number 2544 why I will be homeschooling my children. I talked about this again several episodes ago. That was maybe 2 years ago. I was talking about this, and today I'm going to go into more detail on the entire subject. So let's get to it without any further ado. Point number 1, the topic once again is the case for homeschooling. It's not necessarily me telling you that you should do it. I'm just making a case for it so that you understand it. Number 1, public school. Those of you who have kids in public school right now, or maybe you are a product of public schooling, or you're thinking about sending your kids to a public school, here's what I have to say about public schooling. It is government mandated education. That is not my opinion. That's just the reality. That's what it is. Public school is government mandated education. It's provided by the government, paid for by your tax dollars. That means it's government mandated education. It sounds a lot different when you call it that than if you call it public school. Here's my question to you. Do you trust the government? Leave some space there so you can think about it. Do you trust the government? If you ask most people this question, most American citizens, their answer is no. You don't really mess with the government. Maybe you don't hate the government, but do you actually trust them? Most people's answer is no. But even though you don't trust the government, you send your kids to a government-sponsored building, if your kids are indeed in public school, to be taught by government-sponsored employees. The teachers are government-sponsored. They are paid by the government through dollars that the government took from your paycheck, called your tax dollars, and they do it for 8 hours a day for at least 12 years, kindergarten through 12th grade. Now, ask yourself how that makes sense. I know I have some teachers who listen to this show. All right, when I say that you are a government-sponsored and government-paid employee, that's not a diss to you. It's just the reality of the situation. The government is paying you. The government tells you what you can do and what you can't do. The government tells you what the agenda is of what has to be taught and how it has to be taught to the kids, and you have to adhere to it. Otherwise, you'll lose your paycheck. You'll lose your job. All of this is run by the government. And the question I'm asking to all of you who have kids in public school, do you trust the government? If the answer is no, why are you sending them to a government-sponsored place for 8 hours a day for 12 years? In their most formative time, when their brains are most open and most malleable to learning and accepting new beliefs, why are you sending your kids there for 8 hours a day for 12 years straight? This is an open question. Public school and government-sponsored education, they sound like 2 completely different things, right? When I frame it in a different way. And when you think about it, they are exactly the same. That's exactly what it is. Public school sounds better, but government-sponsored education is the reality of what it is. So if you don't trust the government, again, why are you putting your government in a place where they can have access to your kids, installing a worldview into them during their most formative years, and when their brains are most malleable and most open to suggestion? Why are you sending your kids to such a place? This is a legitimate question if you have never considered it. And if you have considered it, it's still a legitimate question. Given the way the government has relaxed standards and allowed a lot of chaos and nonsense into our world over the last decade plus, I do not trust the government with my children. This is the first point in the case for homeschooling. I simply don't trust the government with my children. Now, are there some positives that can come from public school? Sure, I'll get into some of those as we go through this series. So it's going to be a 4-part series. I am a product of public schooling. My sister is a product of public schooling, and I think we both turned out pretty good. I tell people I have created the success that I've created. Some things I got from public school that were useful for me, but I wouldn't say public school is the reason that I became a successful individual. I will say my success in life is despite my schooling background, not because of it. In the same way that you might have had let's see, what's something negative that could happen to you? You might have fallen off your bike when you were a kid 3 or 4 or 10 times. That doesn't mean falling off your bike is a formula for success. So whenever people try to equate these things, it's not exactly how it works. So again, this is just one I want to plant in your head as we keep moving, because we got a lot to say in this series. Point number 2. Today's topic, once again, is the case for homeschooling. Number 2, your kids can be socialized, because this is one of the biggest challenges with homeschooling. People say, well, how are my kids going to get socialized? They're going to be socially awkward because they won't be around other kids. They'll be at home all the time, and they'll be like this recluse who doesn't know how to deal with other kids. So they need to go to school so they can learn how to socialize and deal with other children. That is a legitimate point until you consider that your kids can be socialized with activities outside of the home that do not require the attendance of a public school. Is this true? Of course it's true. Should I say it again? Your kids can be socialized with activities outside of the home that do not require attending school. In other words, your kids can interact with other kids without going to school. There are other ways to do it. School is not the only way your kids interact with other schools. So what are these ways? I always had this concept of homeschooling, even back in the days when I was in school. Maybe I didn't meet too many people at the high school level who were this, but when I was in college, I met people who had been homeschooled. And when I would meet people who were homeschooled, I would think that any kid who was homeschooled would not be properly socialized because they were in this bubble where they weren't dealing with other kids as much as people like me were, and that they wouldn't be around kids enough to remove that social awkwardness because they had been isolated, sitting at home by themselves with their parents, while other kids were out dealing with other actual humans of their same age. Now, I have evolved my position on this point. My position has evolved on this particular point. A child can be socialized in many ways outside of, again, attending a school building. They can be part of groups of whatever things you want to have them do, whether it's play groups, some type of activity. They can be joining in extracurricular activities such as sports, arts and crafts, etc., other things. They can even homeschool with other kids. I've heard about this. They have these things called pods where, let's say, 5 parents with kids all about the same age, they all pool their money and resources, and one parent will say, I'll be the host. All the kids can come to my house, and then you get one teacher, and then that one teacher teaches all those kids because they're about the same age. And there's your interaction right there, those 5 kids interacting with each other. So that's an example. All right, so depending on your situation, there's a lot of different ways you can do that, whether we're talking to school or we're talking non-school extracurricular activities. And at the same time, let's be clear, not all the kids who are going to the school that your kid might be going to, they might not even be the kind of kids you want your kid interacting with anyway. So it might actually be good that your kids are not interacting with certain kids who would be at that school that you might have sent your kids to. In short, the whole point is school is not the only way for a young person to get experience dealing with other young people or dealing with other humans, period, on a consistent basis. Many parents and advocates of homeschooling default to this as if that's the only way that it can happen. And I consider that a lazy way of thinking. If this is one of the main reasons why you want to send your kid to a school, I would suggest that you reconsider and also take into account all the other points I'm going to make here in this series, because if that's the only reason, again, you can have your kid interact with other kids in a lot of different ways besides sending them to, especially to a public school, a government sponsored school, and getting them a government sponsored education that you really don't have a whole lot of say in if you don't like what's going on. Again, we talked about that a little bit in yesterday's episode. Let's move on to point number 3, because we'll touch on this again as we move in the series. Point number 3, we're talking here today about the case for homeschooling. Number 3, school is 8 hours per day. That's how long school is, right? When you send your kids to school, they're there for 8 hours a day. Now, here's what I want to say about that. The school is spending more time with your kids than you are. Right? True or not? How do you feel about that? If you're sending your kids to school for 8 hours a day, they're spending more time with their classmates and more time learning, quote unquote, from their teachers than they are spending time with you and learning from you. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with this equation? Because this touches again on what I talked about in the first point. Who is actually raising your children? And this is an even bigger point than everything I've talked about so far. Let me ask the question again. Who is raising your children? You're sending your kids to a government mandated and government sponsored and government controlled facility to be taught by people who are paid by the government. The government is raising your kids. By proxy, they're raising your kids because the government controls that building, the government controls the curriculum, and the government controls the teacher who has to teach that curriculum. Therefore, your kids are being taught whatever the government wants them to know, and you really don't have a whole lot of say in the situation. Y'all seen what happens when parents go to school board meetings and voice their displeasure with what's being taught, right? If you don't know, go look up some videos. You'll see. It's the same thing every time. You don't really have a say. So who's raising your kids? The government? You want your kids raised by the government? Again, let me go back to that question. Do you want your kids raised by the government? This is for those of you who are sending your kids to public schools. Now, if you're sending a kid to a private school, then these points are null and void. There's a different conversation. We're talking private school. Because in private school, at least you're putting the money on the table. That means you get a whole lot of say because when you write a check to somebody, they got to take your call. A public school, they will pay lip service to you, but they don't really have to listen to you because their ultimate boss is the government, not you. Because if you pull your kid out of the school, they aren't really losing anything because they'll just replace your kid with somebody else's kid whose tax dollars they're getting. So you don't really have a whole lot of say. Private school, you have a say because you pull your money, they can feel that. They can feel that money being pulled out. Public school doesn't feel it. So who's raising your kids? I asked the question again. I posted a question about this on X a week or two before recording this episode. And the options I gave you were, here's the question that I asked. Who's raising your kids or who's raising kids these days? Is it A, the parents, B, the internet, C, school? And the overwhelming winner was the internet. Some of you parents who are listening to this right now, most of you parents who are listening to this right now, that's applicable to you. Who is raising your kids? You, the parent or parents, the internet or the school? Who's raising your kid? For most of you, the answer ain't the parents. For most of you, your kids are spending more time on the internet and at school than they are spending dealing with and engaging with you. So you are not actually raising your kids. You are providing for your kids. They get food, clothing, shelter from you, but you are sending them to school and you're the one paying for that phone. They're spending more time with those two things than they are spending with you. So who's raising your kids? I'm asking the question for the fifth time. I just want you to think about it. That's why I keep asking the question. Kids are spending more time on their devices, online, on the internet, than they are actually talking to their parents. And even when kids are at school, they're on their phones. I would guess, I don't work in schools, but I guess kids are on their phones all day when they're in class, if they're allowed to be. So whatever they are consuming on that phone or on the internet, usually a combination of both, is having a stronger impact on them than you as a mother or a father is having on your kid. Now that leads to a very uncomfortable follow-up question. What are they consuming on that phone? Probably a bunch of stuff that they don't want you to know that they're consuming. Now, if you're okay with that, I'm okay with it too. They're your kids. I mean, I'm not here to raise your kids. I'm just here to pose some questions. You decide what you want to do. If you're not okay with this, now that you're thinking about it consciously, my question is, what are you going to do about it? That's my question. And what we're talking about here is homeschooling. One of the things that come with homeschooling is that you're spending a lot more time with your kid, and it doesn't take 8 hours a day for your kid to learn what they need to learn in school. I mean, think about what you learned in school between first and eighth grade, let's even say, even up through high school. Did you really need 8 hours a day to learn that stuff? Think about it. The age that you are now at 30 years old or 47 or 52, how much of it do you actually remember? Most of it you don't remember. You may remember the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, but what about the rest of it? Did you need 8 hours a day to learn those things? The things that you remember, the things that you retained, did you need 8 hours a day to learn those? No, but you had to stay there for 8 hours a day. So what school really is, I've said this, I don't know if I said it on this show before, but I've said this many times. I'll make sure I say it here for the record. What school becomes, K through 12 school, it just becomes an extension of daycare. So if you have a kid who's not yet school age, but you send them to daycare every day, you send your kid to daycare for a reason, so that somebody will watch them while you go out and do what you do for the bulk of the day, which is usually going to your job or running your business. That's what daycare is. All school is, K through 12, is just an extension of daycare. So you get to send your kid to that public school where, again, your tax dollars are paying for it, or the private school where you're paying out of your pocket, and all they're doing is babysitting your kid for 8 hours a day. So you go do what you want to do without having to watch over your kid over the course of a day. And again, I'm not saying you're bad for actually doing this, but again, it goes back to the same question I want to ask you again. Who's raising your kids? The private school raising your kid? Is the public school raising your kid? Is the government raising your kid? Is the internet raising your kid? Whichever one is spending the most time with your child, that's who's raising the child. The answer should be you, who's spending the most time with the kid, but are you? Think about it. Just do some math. Now, while you marinate on that, let's recap today's class. This is part one of an ongoing 4-part series, The Case for Homeschooling. Point number one, public school is government mandated education. My question, do you trust the government? If your answer is the same as most people's answers, which is no, why are you sending your kid to a government sponsored place taught by government sponsored employees telling them government sponsored material? And again, I want you to think about that question. Point number two, your kids can be socialized with activities outside of the home that do not require attendance at a school. So anybody thinks, well, I want my kids to socialize with other kids, that's a flimsy reason that parents give for sending their kids to public schools. Is the first thing that many people think when they think they wouldn't want to do homeschooling just for that reason. That's actually not a real reason. It's a good reason. It sounds good, but when you think about it, you can socialize your kids as much as you want when you have full control over their schedule and you don't have to worry about an 8-hour block of time where they're in school every day. Point number three, school is 8 hours per day, as I just said. Who's spending the most time with your kids? Is it the phone/internet? Is it the school? Or is it you, the parent? Usually it's in that order. And you're last, parent. You're last, mom. Dad, you are last. Your kid is spending more time on the internet and more time at school than they're spending talking to you, which means their worldview, by the time they reach the age of the majority, is going to have less to do with you, more to do with what they learn in school, and more to do with what they hear on the internet, regardless of what you think about it, because you don't have as much impact or influence because you're not putting the time in. Now, I want you to marinate on all of that, and tomorrow we're going to talk further on this subject. Again, this is going to be a 4-part series. That said, workonmygame.com, get on my email list so you get my emails every day completely for free, and workonyourgameuniversity.com, have me as your direct coach. Learn more about that by going to the link. Workonyourgameuniversity.com is down below in the description. Work on your game. Dre, all